And so the second talk for this session will be from Pablo. It'll be a discourse interpretation engine sensitive to truth revisions in a story.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for coming to listen. Now, I have two things to say to set this in the right context. Sorry. I'll try not to touch it. First, when I first set off to do this, I was hoping to do something that seemed to me much sexier, but I discovered that this had to be solved on the way, and so I got stuck here. And the other thing is, it is a very, very complex set of, it's a pipeline with several stages. I had to simplify some of them and skip some of them to fit it into this kind of talk. The details are in the paper. If you find you need some extra information, please ask. Okay, so discourse interpretation, basically you get a story, it has a discourse. Stories are known to have a linear sequence of statements. Basically, that's what I consider the discourse. And what I'm really interested here is not just a story, I tell you this discourse and it describes what's happening to these characters, but situations where these characters themselves start telling stories to one another, okay? And this is an embedding. There's two reasons why I think this is interesting. Once, because this is much more prevalent than you would think, okay? You may think, oh no, this is very complex, it never happens. Not true. Most stories we actually consume involve this kind of thing. But the other reason why I find it interesting is because that when you're dealing with one story, like this kind of thing, you only have the story. The story is about a reality that you know nothing about. Whereas in this kind of situation, the story that these people are telling is usually grounded on the world they've just told you about, because it's their world. So you have this little model of how the story relates to the reality it arises from. Now, I didn't want to, there hasn't been much work done on this, and I think one of the reasons is because you would need first to turn the stories into some conceptual description. So I cheat. I start from the conceptual description and then work out what to do from there. One of the problems with getting this kind of thing from natural language is that we don't really know yet what this thing should look like. So what I'm trying to do here is also trying to find what the target should be for this natural language understanding. What does it need to identify that will go into this representation so that we can now use it for what we need to do. Now, this is an example from my corpus. This is system input, and this is a very simple tale, but you can see you can see the little stars. These sort of separate the groups of predicates that come from the interpretation of particular sentences in the story. You can see there's an embedded story there, and this is notation that I've pulled out of my hat, but it's has a kind of start of story predicate and a telling of the story predicate. And with this, I can now reconstruct the actual discourse. You can see that in this particular case, the embedded story is referring to something that's already been told. And this is a particularly interesting feature of these embedded stories. Sometimes they're anaphoric. They're referring to things that you've already been told. There's another kind of story, embedded story in this story, which is this one, where it's basically a command. So someone is ordering someone to do something else. Now, this is interesting because the embedded stories, in many cases, they don't affect the truth of the story you're following in the first place. But you still need to understand the stories they're telling, which are true in a different world, probably, or in a hypothetical world like this one. Okay, so you need to have a mechanism for dealing with this. Just to point out that this particular transcription includes an argument that tells you what kind of modality this second story involves. Okay, this is just the schema for the whole thing. I'll run through it, so just so you know what I'm going to talk about. Now, this is what is happening. I'll try to translate the intuitions into these very, very simple diagrams. On the left here, you have the story that you're being told. On the right is the representation that you're building of the story as it's being told. So if you're being told that this little guy punched someone, and then you build this kind of representation for it, then he meets someone and tells them that he's punched someone, and you just add it to your representation. But you need to know there's this operation there that this story refers to what's happened. Now, this can also happen in a different setting where you're not told what he's been doing first. You're just told that he's telling someone that he did it, and then you build the same representation for this, but because you know what's happening, you kind of accommodate the reference. You're assuming that he's telling the truth, so that's what he did. Now, this is what we call the preluding story. It happens very often. It's a flashback. You're being told of something that happened before, which is to take truth value. But these stories are also used in a different way. So maybe he's telling this thing, but that's not what he did. And then this is what we call a deceptive discourse, and you need to account for this as well. And that gets even a little more complex, because you may be told that he did this, and you build a representation of that. Then you're told that he meets someone and tells them he did something else. Okay, and then you have both mechanisms, and you're going to have to do both things. This is what we call a conflicting discourse, and what you do is you build two representations of the world, and you don't know what's happening. And this is crucial because it happens in most stories, and you get two truths, and if you want to pick one of them, you need to take sides with some of the characters. And now those are interesting stories, because they're much more exciting than flat stories. Okay, and then you get just the basic case where whatever is being said is flagged as modal, so you know you don't have to necessarily build a picture of it being true in your representation of the world. Okay, so that's basically what the problem I'm trying to deal with. How to do it? I wanted a corpus of examples so I could work with. And I picked the set of tales described by Vladimir Prop in his Morphology of the Folktale. I don't know how many of you may see mentioned them the other day. This is a Russian formalist. He took a corpus of corpus of Russian folktales. This is sort of 13 volumes of a huge corpus. Prop took 100 of them, and he analyzed them in terms of the plot relevant structures in them. Okay, so basically, for the ones that he includes in his appendix, we do have, and the analysis that he makes of them. This is a set of little summaries of the plots of these stories, and you can see under each one there's a string of Greek letters, or combination of strange symbols, basically, which represents the analysis he makes of them. So this is a clear case where we have, for a small corpus of stories, we have both a paraphrase of what's happening and an analysis of how the things that are happening relate to one another. So that's what I'm using. I've transcribed the actual summaries of the stories into predicate logic, and I'm trying to ensure that the system I'm building gets to something that matches the abstractions that Prop identified for them. Okay, so this is just a simple example. I don't know, I hope you can read it. Writing's a little small, but just in case you can't, basically that's the frame story that we're working with. And there's two brothers. One of the brothers is told about a princess being kidnapped, and this is an embedded story, and then decides to react, goes to fight the dragon, and gets wounded, and then releases the princess. But someone else arrives to the king before him and claims to have killed the dragon and released the princess. This is a classic false hero sequence as described by Prop. But then he turns up, the princess recognizes him, and this is because they tell the real story of how he did it. Okay, so you can see how this embedded discourses that tell stories of conflicting truth are actually basically the plot of the story. The fact that they're fighting a dragon and releasing a princess is just an anecdote on the way. So this is the kind of situation I want to work with. Okay, so how do we process this kind of embedding? Obviously, the nesting can be infinite, and you need to do something that allows a recursive solution. So basically, I'm building an interpretation that will allow nested stories inside it and a stack to keep track of the context of each story in each case. So this is a different, from a different story. The brother finds another kingdom that goes into the basic interpretation for the frame story. Then the story of the princess's abduction starts, and basically that triggers shuffling of the stories. The story that you're following is put on the stack, and you open a clean story for the new embedded story, and then you process the story that you have inside, which is the dragon kidnapped the 3 princesses, and that gets added to the new story, and that's it. This is a very simple story, but now when you get the statement, this is now a statement in the frame story. So you get to undo the shifting with the stack. You take your embedded story out of the stack, you put the context story back in, you add the embedded story into the frame story, and now you add to the frame story this predicate saying this person tells this embedded story. That's how it works. It can be nested as many times as you need. I may point out some problems with this a little later if I have time. Okay. So what do you do with this now? Now you have this sequence. It can be split into all these embedded different things. And then this is just another story, finds another kingdom. You can see on the left there, you have the sequence as it happens. On the right, you're getting the interpretation that's being built. And down here is the number of views, possible views on the whole story that you're having, which you will see you grow along as you process more of the story, but at some point it will split. There will be 2 possible alternative interpretations, and you'll see it here. Okay, so this is the same kind of thing. Told a story about a princess being kidnapped, then goes fights a princess, then the princess gives him a ring. There's someone else that claims you can see this now claims to have saved the princess. You can now see that this is what the algorithm is doing. Okay, it's finding the alignment, and a lot of these things that I've been hearing today about analogy making will probably help me a lot, because right now the algorithm for doing this matching is very basic. But what it's trying to do is when it finds the alternative story, it has to find this matching. Say this is the same story but with a different protagonist. Okay, and then it has to align them because it has to place it in the correct place, correct chronological order with respect to the main story. Okay, and then at some point the princess recognizes the guy, and this so you can see basically that what's happening here is at this point there's a second story introduced, and now here there's 2 different views that differ only in that segment, and then the princess identifies her savior, and then we're back to 1. Okay, so this is, you now need to build a different representation of the story, which is how many views are being active at a given point in the story. And you can see that sequence there is 1 most of the time, and then at the sentence 10 of the story, it splits into 2, and at 14 it goes back. So you can see this gives you this kind of graph for the number of views that are active in the story at any particular point, which matches Freytag's pyramid of the structure for a story, or the tension of a story as it evolves. So that's what the system is doing. I run it over all the stories that Prop had analyzed in his appendices, and you can see some of the data here for the different types of embedded discourse. You can have preluding stories, which are the ones that refer sort of flashbacks that tell you about something that happened before the start of the main story, anaphoric references to parts of the discourse you've already been told, false stories told by someone trying to deceive other characters, and modal stories. You can see the numbers there. It's interesting to see there's only 1 story in the set, doesn't have any embedded discourses. Okay, all the others have at least 1, and many of them have several. So it's this clearly, a mechanism that can do this is clearly a useful addition to our toolbox. Now, in terms of metrics, the system that I've developed does pretty well at identifying this. The only problem it has is here, because there's some of the anaphoric stories that it should find that it doesn't find, it misclassifies them as false stories. This is actually an interesting point, because what happens is these stories are themselves nested. And the matching algorithm I'm using to find the similarities basically gets stumped when the stories it's trying to match have themselves nested stories. Okay, so that's what I wanted to tell you about. I am trying to extend this to more complex discourses. This is Italian opera plots, and just an example, this is one of them. You can see it does have, I won't go through that in a lot of detail, but you can see there's a number. Basically, someone goes on stage and says, I've just killed the king, and then goes somewhere else and tells the heir to the throne that your brother killed the king, and then someone comes back and says, I've just killed the brother, and then someone comes back and says, no, it wasn't the brother, it was someone else. So you basically, again, you see that the plot of this one is all in the stories that they're all telling each other. And nothing much actually happens on stage, which is what happened in the sort of 18th century opera. No violence on stage, of course. Okay, so this is the same thing and same views. What this says about this is basically this is a roller coaster of a plot. It's all the time changing who done it, basically. 17th century, 18th century, what are they? Okay, so conclusions. This sort of works for what it's supposed to do, this embedded discourse, which I think it's important. It does find a plausible order by finding something, the bits that match partially. And I think this is the reason why I started with this. I've been trying to do story generation, automated story generation for 20 years now. And I can generate thousands of stories. The trick is telling which of those are good. And I reckon this kind of solution may help me to identify which of those stories are good. Also, none of the stories I had created to this point included this kind of mechanism, which I now see is quite important. So my next goal might be to do that kind of thing. Okay. So, and that's basically it. I had a few lines on possible lines of future work, but I can, if anybody's interested, I can go in detail then. Thank you.
I have a challenge for you. I don't know if you know it. It's Heinlein's All You Zombies. The guy's telling a story about how he invents a time machine, goes back in time, finds a woman he falls in love with, has sex, goes back to his current time. He has a sex change, goes back in time again, meets himself first, falls in love, has a baby who then grows up to be the storyteller.
See, you need complex machinery to do this kind of thing, and there's more and more of that of late.
It's pretty good. Yeah, there's some movies that really, want to go anywhere near plot line with this. So the really interesting question I think that you now need to solve, right, is how do you import some but not all of the knowledge from the sub-story, right? That there are parts of the sub-story that are really important and there are parts of the sub-story that are filler. Do you have ideas about how to go about doing that?
It's very tricky because the stories that interest, there's also stories that have nothing to do with the main story, like in Arabian Nights, right? Just telling stories. But when the stories involve the same characters and you have to work out the relations between them, and once you assume that one of them, some of them may not be, some of what they say may not be true. It's not so much how much detail, but how much of the relevant detail is actually true. And right. That you may get from the context sometimes. But as I say, there's a number of really much sexier problems, but they needed this to be solved first.
kind of in a similar vein as before, but what you were saying about how you wind up with like this kind of peak in the number of viewpoints, like at the climax of the story, that really does remind me of like kind of those like sprawling crime genre sort of movies, like Pulp Fiction or something like that, where everything kind of comes together at the end. Have you put thought into like maybe trying to analyze those? I know you've got more than like your work cut out for you with the stuff you're already working on, but like, have you considered?
I mean, the problem with this is it doesn't stop there, because you may think that's an unnecessary proliferation of representations in parallel, but in fact, what I'm beginning to consider, because of several of these things, is I will probably need one of those for each character, because each character knows differently, has a different view on the world, and the actual analysis of how all these things interact would come out from comparing, contrasting the levels of knowledge of the different characters and how they evolve over time.
Thank you. So I do think this is a great topic for the cognitive systems community, and there's been some work on it, obviously, but I'd love to see more. So thanks for coming. Can you do Rashomon?
Sorry?
The movie Rashomon, the Kurosawa movie, where there's the same story told from four
right.
different perspectives.
That's more related to a slightly different task that I'm also working on, which is narrative composition, where you have a set of facts and then you have to find different ways of telling them. But it is, and one of the things that I was really hoping to do, but I couldn't do because I needed to work this out first, is assign different points of view to the different characters. Obviously, the victim thinks of themselves as the victim and the villain as the villain, but the villain might think they're just a hero being doing justice, right? So once you get this possibility of identifying different points of view, then you can tell the story from each of the different points of view.
Now, so I know you weren't working on this, but it seems related. In jokes, there's toward the end, there's some shift. Some punchline involves some subversion or something, and I'm guessing that you have something to say about that, but you probably can't quite get it yet. Is that fair? Do you see how you might?
I think it's actually the same thing. It's this basic structure of setting up two possible interpretations and keeping the choice.
Well, the thing about jokes though is often the final interpretation is not one you suspect until the end, and so that's what's a little weird about it.
But you need to first have this kind of model, and then when you're deciding how to tell it, you need to tell it so that you're hiding one of them until the end.
Good.
The revealing moment.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
And then